everybody. Thank you for taking the time out of your afternoon to join us today. I think especially with the weather outside, probably a lot of you would like to be out making the most of it. So for those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Andrew Murphy. I am the co-founder and director of Coopman Search and Selection. We are a specialist financial services recruitment firm. We launched last November, myself and my business partner, Mark Fallon. We work out of Dublin across all areas of financial services in a number of different specialisms. And I think over the last few weeks, we've really tried to engage with the market in terms of what's going on, speak to people about certain topics. So this is our second webinar during the lockdown. We had one a few weeks ago where we talked about managing teams remotely. And I suppose naturally now coming out of that, the government have released a 5-phase step for coming out of the lockdown that we're now starting to think about when we start to move back to the office. So myself and Mark thought that it'd be great to hold another webinar solely with the purpose of giving practical advice to employers and companies and even employees about what the new workplace is going to look like, and I suppose the steps in order to get there and once we are there. So we're delighted to have Jerry Corcoran join us today. Jerry works for BNP Paribas Real Estate. He's been there for the last 2.5 years. They have a workplace solutions and strategic design consultancy, which Jerry heads up, having been a well-known and highly experienced architect and project manager. We're delighted to have Jerry on to talk us through what's going on and essentially in how companies are getting their offices ready. So welcome, Jerry.
Thanks, Andrew. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to Andrew and Coopman for inviting me on to talk to you today. I suppose, just by way of introduction, I'm the Divisional Director in BNP Paribas Real Estate here in Dublin. We're part of the BNP Paribas Group, which obviously is across Europe and Asia with 6 business lines consisting of property development, transactions, investment management, property management, valuations and consulting. My particular area, as I said, it's workplace solutions within the property management business line.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jerry. So look, the last few weeks have certainly been interesting, but perhaps the best place to start, and maybe the question on a lot of people's minds, is when come August the 10th or whatever the date may be, when we go back to the office, what is the office going to look like?
Good question. And I suppose, to be fair, each different sector will be different. I suppose if we look first of all at the kind of government, the current plans in terms of the reopening phases, obviously phase 1 has commenced, which is the initial start for construction outdoor workers. Most or many of the larger sites in particular have started up now, albeit on a slow phase stage, just to test their systems before they start to move people back in. Later on, June the 8th, of course, we're going to see the next phase, which is where people can work remotely or separately at a 2-meter distance. And then moving on from that, we're looking at employees with low levels of daily interaction towards the end of June. Into July, then it's obviously employees who cannot work remotely, and for shift workers and stagger workers. And then the final phase obviously is envisaged for August the 10th, where all other workers will come back. Obviously, these 5 gradual stages can change over time as matters evolve and develop. But I suppose specifically, we're looking at stages 2 to 5, really. I mean, obviously stage 1, as I said, is for outdoor workers. And again, as I said, all sectors and each different type of office environment needs to do with their own kind of independent review of what their needs are and what they envisage will occur once they get up and running. So, like in simple terms, each employer needs to do a specific sort of workplace risk assessment of the workplace, but in addition, we would advise that they need to do a risk assessment of all their employees also, because in addition, obviously, to trying to reopen the business to get back to work in the workplace, one needs to consider the impacts that have occurred in the recent weeks and months on individual employees. I mean, obviously, some people will regrettably have had bereavements in their family, or either family members or close friends or persons they may share properties with and so on. Then equally, we have people who will have underlying health conditions that need to be considered. And obviously, there's the other element of the anxiety that has been visited upon most people as a result of these changes. So I suppose, as I said, specifically, each separate environment, each individual sector has to carry out its own individual appraisal.
If you take that in its context, then that each environment is different, are there any kind of common challenges that each office will ultimately face in terms of structurally setting up their office?
Yeah, again, I suppose if you look at the types of office environments, assuming one is looking to get one's people back into the workplace, the simplest work environment perhaps is, ground floor office, own door access, where you are not, I suppose, constrained by elements outside your four walls. In effect, you can carry out changes and so on internally. Where it becomes complicated is obviously where you're in buildings of a number of floors, where you're sharing common areas, lifts, toilets, and so on, and you've got to try and engage and develop a plan with property management and perhaps with other tenants to try and come up with a comprehensive shared plan as to how you use the space, obviously the common areas. There are difficulties around that because I suppose typically in the Irish environment, in terms of our offices, most lifts, for example, are sort of 8 to 10 person capacity, which are suitable for their need in that respect, but in terms of trying to maintain physical separation, they're quite small. Like in reality, you won't get 2 meter separation within a lift. The reality is you get a single person in. So again, you kind of have to do a risk analysis on that as to what's appropriate. Do you try and restrict the lift use to one person at a time? It's very difficult if you have 50 staff who are trying to get onto the 5th floor of a building. Or you look at procedures whereby perhaps you wear face guards when you enter the lift, maybe you face the walls within the lift. Okay. So there are kind of, again, sort of step-by-step guidance and approaches that you have to take, particular to those kinds of buildings. I know people have spoken about trying to have one-way systems within buildings, or perhaps you have one lift going up, one going down, or perhaps in the morning time the lifts are used just for people to go up into the office floors, and if people are already on upper floors and they want to come down, they come down via staircases. So again, you have to look at each one independently and see what works best.
So in terms of employers having to create a workplace preparedness plan, which I think is kind of what you're alluding to there, is there any advice on how best to go about that? Should they look to follow guidelines and do it themselves, reach out to consultancy? What advice would you have?
Well, what we've been doing up to now over the last couple of weeks really is we've been engaging predominantly with employers, in some cases with landlords, but predominantly with employers within office environments where we're going in and chatting to them with their facilities management team. And in the first instance, we're obviously trying to understand what their objective is, how many people they want to get back into the environment, whether they're going to stagger that in terms of alternating days or alternating weeks. And then we try and help them to put some shape around that in terms of giving them guidance as to what they need to do. Obviously, the key priority is in terms of the physical use of the premises is trying to maintain the separation, and of course, the guidance is the 2 meter separation where possible, where practical. The government protocol that was issued on the 8th of May had slight change in that respect because it allows for where the 2 meters can't be achieved. The allowance is that you can put in screens, sneeze screens as they're called typically, around desks.
Yeah,
to try and just to try and keep that separation. In larger office environments, our advice is, for example, where you could have a row or bank of seating side by side and opposite. The suggestion is that you split the employee groups into teams. So, for example, you could have, let's say, a red team who occupy desks 1, 3, 5, and 7, okay. And then on an alternate day or alternate week, you'd have a blue team who would occupy desks 2, 4, 6. The idea being that at any given time, your desk, which remains your desk, this is not, we're not talking about shared desking here now, we're talking about this is your seat. So that on any given day, you're at your seat and you don't have anybody either side of you or directly opposite you. That's kind of the ideal environment where you're providing that kind of level of separation and protection for our colleagues.
So if I'm an employer then, and I'm looking at things going, okay, I have to get my office ready. When I reached out to say yourself, what would the process look like from kind of engaging to kind of making those structural changes?
Yeah, well, again, I suppose the first thing is to try and determine what the employer expectations are. And secondly is physically, or at a minimum, try and get floor plans of the existing layout to understand the seating arrangements, desking, offices, breakout areas, kitchens, canteens, storerooms, and so on. And then do an analysis of the floor plan. Ideally, if possible, then is to get in and do an actual physical survey. So you actually take measurements of the proximity of seats, one to the other, desks, and so on and so forth. Look at walkways, passages, look at kitchens, access, bathrooms, offices, looking at occupancy again, the size of meeting rooms, size of meeting room tables, to see what can be done in terms of achieving the separation that's required. So it's kind of a detailed analysis of the floor plan in the first instance, and then preparing an alternate plan, which would be the adapted layout. And then it's a matter of going through the various iterations then to try and come up with a solution that works best for the employer. Clearly, in addition to all of that, you need to look at the whole issue of movement throughout the space, where you're trying to limit that kind of interaction with people if there's desks too close to walkways and so on, or where you might find you could have a bank of desks and directly behind that you may have a walkway into a tea station or a kitchen area. You may need to look at not using a row of seats, for example, if it's too close, but particularly with the high levels of movement behind you between kitchens and so on. So you're looking at the practicality of what level of desking you can use, and then what levels of desking that you may have to suspend for a period of time. And again, just trying to develop that through and agree it with the employer.
How long would that process take from, say, start to finish of when
typically a matter of a few days, depending on the level of information, and 3-4 days.
I suppose a question a lot of people might have, and it's probably quite hard to put a number on, is costing, but is there a general guide around?
Not really. It depends. It depends on the size of the office environment. Depends on the level of intervention that the employer may want to do. Obviously, some employers may take the view that, that they will simply limit the occupancy of the floor rather than go to the expense of maybe stripping out desks and putting in screens and partitions. So it really depends on the employer's aims, because obviously many employers at this point are relatively happy with the work from home policies that they have in place, and that their business are running efficiently and right now at this point in time they're quite happy with where they are. Obviously, none of us knows really how long this is going to continue, so this kind of a value judgment has to be made as to how extensive the works may need to be, or if they may need to be extensive at all, because clearly there's an expectation that at some point this will relax, but we don't know. My own view is, I think, irrespective of whatever relaxations will occur as time goes on, I think the physical separation will continue for a long period of time. It may not continue at the 2 meter distance that we have currently. It may reduce. I know, for example, in France, it's at 1 meter. I think in Australia, it's 1.5. So different jurisdictions are taking different views. Now, obviously, we're still fixed with our 2 meters, and that's perfectly understandable. The UK is the same. The US is the same. But as time goes on, there will be some. I imagine there will be some changes in that. But at the same time, I said I don't expect it to fully be removed. I think the physical separation and the non-contact will continue for a period of time.
So obviously the process only takes, say, what you're saying, a few days. Are many people making changes to their offices now? And at what point would you advise employers to start looking at doing this if they haven't already? What's the kind of...
Well, we would advise all employers to start the process now. I mean, again, the protocol that was issued on the 8th of May makes it very clear that all employers must, in the first instance, appoint a COVID-19 response management team from within the workforce. That team then are tasked with putting together the plan. Further to that, in addition to that, the employer must appoint an employee representative who is tasked with ensuring that the plan is carried out once the workers are back in the environment. And it's a precondition to getting back to the workplace. So really, all employers should be taking active steps right now to A, put a team in place, and B, to seek guidance and advice where necessary in order to ensure that they can meet the guidance and the regulations. Obviously, the big issue here to understand is that the legislation that controls all of this is the Safety, Health and Welfare at Work Act 2005. And we'll have seen in recent days talks about the HSA ramping up in terms of their number of inspections and the number of inspectors. I mean, I believe at the moment they only have approximately 70 inspectors. They're hoping to get that up to some near 200. So clearly the intention is to carry out numerous and repeated inspections of the workplace over the next number of weeks and further on as this continues. So the legislation, of course, in respect of the Health and Safety Act is quite onerous and places quite significant obligations on employers. So it's very important, obviously, that employers are seen to be taking best advice and taking all the steps necessary to ensure the workplace is safe for their employees on the return.
You mentioned there about kind of the COVID response management team, and I think it's the COVID compliance officer. Who are the best people in the organizations to be taking on these roles, and I suppose what should their priorities be?
Yeah, typically what we would recommend is that management team should be led by an executive director or a person at director level, and then perhaps in addition to that, a HR director, or again somebody quite senior in HR, and then perhaps the health and safety representative within the organization. So it needs to have teeth. It needs to be a strong group that can obviously engage with management and ensure that the policies and practices are approved and implemented.
Okay. So let's, I suppose, again, fast forward, the companies have engaged, they've got their teams in place, they've made the necessary structural changes, people that are now, say, working in the office. What are going to be the main hazards in the office? And I suppose the second question to that is, how can employers change their procedures to minimize those hazards?
Yeah, look, in simple terms, the hazard is obviously the infection. The risk analysis is looking at how best the steps can be taken, what measures can be taken to control that. In simple terms, first thing to do is you look at the physical workplace, you look at the ergonomics of how it's laid out and what steps you need to take to modify that. As I said, some cases it may be a matter of moving desks apart, maybe putting in screens where the physical separation can't be achieved. The alternative, in addition to that, one should consider the breaking up of the workforce into teams, such that, for example, you should have perhaps no more than 50% of your workforce in the workplace at a given time. And as I said, alternating seating arrangements and alternating days or weeks when the employees are back in the workplace all helps, because the logic here is obviously, on the one hand, you're reducing the capacity in terms of the numbers of people in the workforce, thereby reducing the closeness or proximity of contact between them. Secondly, by splitting it into the, let's call them, two adjacent groups, you are trying to ensure that in the event that a person in team A falls ill or is suspected of being ill, that the impact of that is limited to that team that are there presently at that time, and it doesn't affect the entire workforce. they're probably the key issues in terms of the occupational movement of people within the property, within the premises.
If you go to more of a granular level, and I know from when we had our initial conversation, and it was kind of really eye-opening for me, but it was even things like not using the water cooler or not having access
yes. All those kind of passive measures, indeed. Yes, yeah.
More about those particular hazards?
Yes, indeed. There are considerations certainly that perhaps water coolers shouldn't be used. If they are to be used, then people have to be very careful about cleaning before. I mean, obviously you can have water coolers where they're automated, where you just place the cup or the glass in front of them and then they fill automatically. We don't have to make contact with them. In addition to that, the use of cups and so on, and recommendation is obviously that you don't have, let's call it the communal use of kitchen cutlery and canteen ware, that perhaps each employee has their own cup or their own bottle and so on, and they take it home with them and clean it and bring it back, so that you're not sharing typically what we have done in the past with utensils and so on in kitchens. So that would be a concern, certainly, and it would be a consideration that perhaps the water cooler in the corner is perhaps not used, or if it is, said it's used in a very careful and safe manner, such as using your own cups and bottles and so on. There are obviously a whole host of other things that we need to consider. The Holy Trinity, I suppose, as it's being called quite frequently, is the three principal steps, which is obviously physical distancing, good hand hygiene, so regular hand washing and regular sanitization if you can't wash ordinarily. And then thirdly, obviously, there's the whole issue of cough etiquette or respiratory etiquette, as we call it. So it's a matter of each individual being careful about themselves, and then in turn being careful about how they engage with others around them in terms of hygiene and so on.
Yeah, because I suppose that's a big thing, isn't it? I know the governments are really pushing that out, is that for this to work, it's a shared responsibility between employers and employees. So I suppose how, maybe your advice on how can they both work together to maintain a safe working environment? Because I suppose that's going to always present risks and a challenge in that continual cleaning and cleansing.
Yeah. Again, I suppose the first thing in terms of that about the relationship between the employer and employee is fundamentally that the plan that the employer and the response team will put together should be shared with all the employees. So the employees are made fully aware of the plans that are being put into place in terms of the initial response plan before, I suppose, even before works commence. But then secondly, and we're advising this with certain clients, is that once the works have been carried out in the workplace, we're advising that they should perhaps do a video walkthrough with a voiceover, perhaps from the managing director of the company and so on. And that video then is shared with all the employees who are ordinarily working at home, so that they can literally see the changes that have occurred in the workplace. And it's explained to them what has been done and why it has been done, and the various steps and controls that have been put in place, just to allow them to have an understanding before they come back. So it's not a matter of they're walking into what is in some cases could be quite a different environment to the one they left. Obviously, this will also help in some respects with concerns and anxieties that employees will have, because again, we're all different, and many people will have different responses and reactions to what has occurred over the last number of weeks and months, and that has to be very carefully managed and monitored and understood. Which again, as I was saying earlier, about you almost have to do a risk assessment on each individual employee, just to ensure that you're trying to do when you're doing the best for everybody in the context of trying to get the workplace back up and running.
Yeah, it's ensuring that everyone feels comfortable in the changes that are being made, that it can work.
Absolutely,
everybody. In terms of kind of the risk assessment, and I'd imagine the workplace will have to be audited on an ongoing basis. How regular should that be? What should that process look like in terms of, should it be at the start of the day, the midday, and end of day, to ensure that it's still clean in a sense?
Well, again, I suppose in terms of the risk assessment, our advice on that is that obviously a risk assessment is prepared at the outset in conjunction with the management plan for the adaptation and the changes that will occur within the office environment. We would recommend then also that perhaps 30 days out, a month out, that whole plan should be reviewed again with feedback from the employees to get a better understanding of what has worked well and what areas perhaps haven't worked quite as well or as well as had been originally envisaged, and then to adapt and modify the plan to try and improve on the situation. The employee representative is tasked with ensuring that the practices and procedures that are in place are adhered to throughout the working day. That's really their function. It's to try and be available on the floor across the office, and just to ensure that people are mindful of what they need to do. Of course, in advance of all of this, before one returns to work, there's obviously an induction period as well that's necessary. So colleagues are in effect trained up before the return to understand what it is they need to do. And that will cover everything from the basic principles of hand hygiene to understanding the correct way to put on and to remove facial screens or masks, as the case may be, how to use hand sanitizers, thermometers if they're available, how they need to be used, and best practice in respect of all of those areas. So there is obviously a lot of preparatory work in addition to, let's say, the physical works that may occur within the workplaces, preparatory work in trying to prepare a document to help the colleagues understand what it is they need to do, what their obligations are, and what best practices are for them when they return, both for their own safety and for the safety of those around.
And what's your understanding, Jerry, of the government then, in terms of the inspections piece? Obviously, when the workplace is functioning, will they give notice? Is it going to be random? Do you have an idea?
No, well, typically the HSE inspections are random and they're unannounced, and that's part of their remit. They can just arrive and knock on your door and request access to come in and look at your plan, look at the physical layout of your office environment, and ask questions and take notes and make recommendations if they feel that certain aspects of the procedures need to be improved. In the worst case scenario, of course, they can close the business.
Yeah. And there's going to be a lot of emphasis come August 10th, when we're in the 5th phase, that they will go out to a lot of premises and a lot of offices.
Well, I think they've started already. They have started already on certain premises. I don't know which ones, but they have already advised that they have carried out inspections already, and they will continue to do so. So certainly, as the work environment opens up, as workplaces open up, I would imagine there will be more and more tests or inspections carried out, and re-inspections in certain cases also.
So the relationship between the employee representative and the management team is crucial then, because
very important indeed, very important.
If you're spotting any practices not being adhered to and allowing the management team to take action. Do you think that they can put in place from the very start? Obviously, they can share the plan, but is there anything that they can do as a team to ensure that they effectively manage this?
Well, I think again the management team should meet perhaps in the first week or so. They should probably meet on a daily basis, just to review what is occurring in the workplace, and to see if any additional procedures need to be put in place, or if any additional guidance has to be given, or if some basic changes may need to occur. Because obviously it's a new and evolving situation in any workplace. It's unique. Obviously, we haven't been faced with anything like this before, so there will have to be some kind of on-the-job learning for everybody. And there has to be that flexibility within the plan to make modest changes. Obviously, maintaining safety being paramount in all of this, but some minor passive changes that may occur to how the practices are carried out, that needs to be an option if it needs to be amended and updated.
Okay.
And as time goes on, as the practices sort of bed in and people are more comfortable with the day-to-day interaction and what they need to do, then that can lessen. But certainly in the initial stages, the initial week or 2 weeks perhaps, depending on how the employees and groups return to work, I think there has to be quite a level of vigilance and observation and engagement then also with colleagues, so everybody understands what they need to do.
Yeah, keep the engagement, the communication, the feedback at a higher level at the beginning until, I suppose, some sort of routine is created where everybody becomes comfortable with operating within that office environment.
Yeah, I think it's hugely important that, the term, the town hall meeting, which of course would be a town hall meeting now at 2 meter separation distance, but I think it's very important that within the workforce, certainly over the first few days, that there may be from time to time throughout the working day, even just to get everybody's attention and just have a brief chat and engage sort of on a one-to-one, perhaps even across the floor, and say, how are you finding this? How is it working for you? Do you have any concerns? Do you have any issues? Is there anything that you think perhaps needs to be changed? Is there anything we need to do to make you feel more comfortable? So I think it's very important that there is that 360 feedback between the employer and the employees, because again, as I said, there could be anxieties and issues that we're not aware of from outside the workplace, that once employees come back in, that could manifest themselves, and it has to be carefully managed.
And then let's play out a scenario then that somebody gets or shows symptoms, I should say, of COVID-19 during the working day. Is there any particular protocols that you would foresee that they have to?
Yes, indeed. Again, the guidance is, and I suppose on that subject, I suppose we need to be careful here, because certain employers and certain organizations are using thermometers for temperature readings of employees, and I think that's appropriate, and there's a particular use for that, certainly, but I think that needs to be looked at in the context of the other symptoms that one might have also, because I think short of somebody having a very high temperature, I think a slight increase in temperature in its own right is probably not a major area of concern. I think one needs to look at heightened temperature in addition to difficulty breathing and perhaps sore throat or dry cough, other factors that might indicate symptoms consistent with COVID-19, because obviously somebody could have a high temperature and have the flu. But in any event, if there's a concern either with the employee, or if they make it known to the employer, to the employer representative that they have concerns, then again, the obligation is for each workplace to have an isolation room, and obviously in larger work environments they may have to have more than one. But the obligation is to have an isolation room that, in the event that somebody does fall in during the working day, that they're brought to the isolation room, and from there, the policy and the guidance is that they should go immediately to their home place and isolate, and obviously contact their GP, and in turn contact HR, their employer, to ensure obviously they got home safely and that they're taking reasonable steps to isolate and to protect themselves thereafter.
Okay. And in terms of the isolation room, I'd imagine that is identified at the beginning during the risk assessment, is it?
Should be. And typically in most office environments, it will be a small meeting room, somewhere that somebody can come in, have a seat for a while, and perhaps the first aid person in the office comes to check on them to ensure that everything is okay, and they make the steps to ensure they get home safely.
Okay.
On that, I suppose, and there is a bit of a grey area that's come up in recent days, and we've been talking about that in respect of vulnerable employees. Obviously, persons with underlying health conditions would obviously be classified as vulnerable, and they should perhaps continue to work from home until matters have moved on much further than where they are right now. But equally, and we had a conversation about this in the office, in the context of, you may have an employee who lives alone and travels by public transport and doesn't drive or doesn't own a car. If that person were to exhibit symptoms having returned to the workplace, there's a grey area as to how they get home, because obviously they can't drive. It's not recommended to take public transport. So it might be that as part of the risk analysis, you might say, well, that particular individual, perhaps for their own safety, continues to work at home.
Okay.
If for no other reason other than it might prove difficult for them to get home in the event that they may fall ill in the workplace.
So you do kind
Again,
of,
as I said, it's a case by case kind of analysis.
you do a risk assessment on your employees, assess who is fit to, say, return to the office, get a sense of what your numbers are going to look like, and then make the structural changes thereafter.
Yes.
With the plan of how they're going to ultimately operate and how they're going to maintain a safe environment. That's kind of,
yes, exactly.
In terms of kind of PPE, I know it's kind of referring to kind of gloves and masks. I don't know, I get the impression there seems to be a bit of mixed messaging. What would be your advice around the use of those?
Yeah, the PPE issue is, I suppose, if you look at the controls that currently exist in terms of the 2005, the Safety, Health and Welfare at Work Act, they identified the control measures, and funnily enough, PPE is at the bottom of the triangle. The control hierarchy, item 1 obviously is you eliminate the risk. Item 2, or level 2, is you substitute the risk. 3 is you isolate it, and then 4, you introduce engineering controls, which is obviously the physical controls in the workplace in respect of moving desks or putting in screens, introducing one-way systems, limiting the movement of people in smaller kitchen canteen areas, limiting the movement of people in and out of bathrooms. Again, if they're small, you may have a policy of 1 in, 1 out, or 1 at a time. Lifts similarly. So they're kind of engineering controls. Administrative controls then is the next phase of the hierarchy, which is to do, as I said, with introducing the team structure, perhaps, where you have 50% in one week, 50% the other week. There's no overlap, so the risk of cross-contamination in the event of somebody falling ill doesn't occur. A PPE is at the very bottom. It's level 6. So in other words, PPE is it's considered to be the kind of the last resort in effective control of risk. And I suppose similarly, HSE and the government have perhaps taken a similar view on that, because the advice, the frequent and recurring advice, is continually wash your hands, physically separate, good respiratory etiquette. PPE in respect of facial coverings or masks, non-surgical masks and so on, are advised to be used in certain circumstances. Obviously, at the moment, the
Signal's just gone there, Jerry. Come back now, hopefully.
Using public transport. Other than that, it's not recommended, I suppose, is the best way to put it.
We missed a little bit of you there, Jerry. It's kind of
sorry.
But,
there was a phone call came in on the.
Is it okay? I mean, in terms of the PPE, the government are advising that there's training around kind of the storing, using, and disposal of it. So obviously, if somebody wears a mask or gloves in the workplace and they put it in the bin,
yeah. Well, again, that should be all part of the induction. That where masks are provided, and to be fair, most employers are providing masks for their employee use. but there's a level of discretion around that. And obviously, the recommendation is said is you use them on public transport or in areas where you're likely to be encountering large numbers of people. But again, it's a matter for individual or particular employees to decide how they want, or employers to decide how they best want to use that, or how they want to encourage their staff to use it. Some employees will obviously feel safer, I suppose, if they can avail of the use of facial aids and facial masks and so on, and that's fine. But certainly you're absolutely right in terms of the use of them, and that should be certainly part of the induction prior to the employee's return to work. Safe use in terms of how you place the mask on your face, how you fix it around your nose and mouth, and then equally and most importantly, how you dispose of it after. And fundamentally, in between those two stages is the principle that you shouldn't touch the mask, of course. So once it's on, you don't touch it, and once you take it off, you don't touch the center of the cloth part of the mask. Equally, take it off over your ears, drop it into the bin, and dispose of it accordingly. Obviously, with cloth face masks that are being encouraged as well, they obviously can be reused after being washed and so on. So they, again, but the recommendation would be that when you take it off, you bag it and tie the bag, and keep it in a safe location for return home to clean it and to reuse it thereafter. Similarly with the area of gloves, gloves are commonplace on construction sites and so on, but they're obviously safety gloves rather than gloves to prevent the movement of infection. The recommendation respected is perhaps that if persons are wearing gloves, they may feel that I'm safe, I have gloves on, I don't need to wash as frequently as perhaps I should. So the advice there also is that gloves should be used only where absolutely necessary. But again, the mantra is wash your hands, as Joe Duffy would say.
Wash your hands. And look, I think you put PPE alongside kind of hygiene facilities. And when I was looking at the return to work safety protocol that the government released, I felt that it was just very generic. It just said hygiene facilities have to be in place. What are these hygiene facilities? How do you assess how much is appropriate per office?
Well, typically what we're doing now, for example, on a let's say a small, relatively small office, maybe 25, 30 employees, we're saying that there should be a hand sanitizer pedestal at the entrance for people when they arrive. In addition to that, we would recommend that there's a wall-mounted hand sanitizer, refillable apparatus on the wall in each of the WCs and in the kitchen area, so that they're frequently located around particular areas. But in addition to that, each desk should have, each employee at their desk should have their own hand sanitizer, 200, 250 ml bottle that they use frequently. And that obviously there should be adequate supplies in place to replenish that. But certainly in terms of hand hygiene, those facilities should be in place. In addition, of course, in the bathroom environment, obviously wash hand basins and so on. So the recommendation there is obviously that you have adequate supplies of soap, typically liquid soap, for use, and that you should have hand towels, paper towel, paper napkin for hand drying rather than the electric hand dryers. Okay. So like they would be the main areas around hand hygiene.
Okay.
Obviously then in addition, if employees are using masks, there should be receptacles for masks, perhaps in the event that people arrive to work having used public transport, they arrive wearing a mask, so that they can take the mask off, dispose of the mask appropriately, hand sanitize, and then come into the office place.
Okay. And just while we're talking, Jerry, we're kind of talking there about kind of, when you go to the bathroom, hand sanitizing, it just made me think about the canteen. Where are people going to be advised to eat at the desk? Is there still going to be a canteen?
That the canteen is used.
You just broken up there, Jerry.
Exclusively. Sorry.
Can you repeat that? Sorry, it's just the signal went.
There. Sorry. Canteen areas, drinks only.
Drinks only.
And that employees should return to their own desk then to snack or to have lunch, unless they're going outside, of course.
Okay.
But certainly the kitchen area and the canteen area should not be used ordinarily for people to sit down and to consume foodstuffs.
Okay, so I'm kind of painting the picture here. So if I'm an employee, I'm going back to my office. I could be sat at a desk with a perspex screen. I could obviously be 2 meters apart from someone else. I'm eating my food at my desk. I'm bringing bottled water in because I'm not using the water cooler. Potentially to go out for a coffee if they're open. And I'm going to the bathroom maybe one at a time, and then obviously washing hands on a regular basis. Is that essentially what office life is going to look like?
Yeah, that's a pretty accurate picture of what it will look like in many offices, certainly. In addition to that, then you may have where an office environment is such that the walkways are narrow. You may have to look at introducing one-way systems, either one-way sort of end-to-end within the office environment, or a one-way sort of circulation route around the office, just to try and limit, again, the close contact of people. Obviously, if people are moving at pace from their desk to a designated point, if I'm getting up to go to the bathroom or to go to the kitchen, the recommendation obviously is that you go directly to the place that you intend to go to. You don't hang around and have a chat leaning against a column in the middle of the floor chatting to people. That really has to be discouraged as well. That that close proximity and engagement with people is not recommended. Obviously, if it's only a matter of a couple of minutes, it's perhaps not as risky as prolonged engagement with somebody in close proximity, particularly directly face to face. But typically, the guidance and the recommendation is that one should be, at your workplace or somewhere else, and the engagement with your work colleagues should only occur in an environment where there's adequate space between you.
Okay. And before I go home, am I to clean my desk, clean my computer, do it when I enter? Is there that responsibility as well?
Well, yeah, the guidance is clear that workplaces should be cleaned at least twice a day. And again, some employers in some sectors, particularly, I suppose, it'll depend on the size and the facilities that are available. So some employers may have permanent on-site cleaning staff that are throughout the day going around cleaning, but certainly at a minimum, the workplace should be cleaned down twice a day. We're also advising that in advance of the return to work, that contractors are brought in to do sort of a deep cleaning, disinfecting of the workplace before the work colleagues return.
Okay, that's good to know. And I think then, just kind of finishing up, Jerry, taking a look into the future, and I know it's very hard to know what that looks like because every week it's almost different. But in terms of these measures, do you believe they will be in place until we kind of find a vaccine? And then the second question to that is the structural changes that employers are going to ultimately make. How difficult are they going to be, or how expensive are they going to be to reverse if?
Yeah, look, again, it depends on the level of intervention. For instance, in real terms, moving and repositioning desks at a later stage is not significant in terms of cost. Obviously, if one has to introduce things such as, for example, if you want to put automatic door opening devices in place to limit the contact of touch with door handles and so on, they can be relatively expensive to install. The reality is, if you were to install those, you're probably not going to take them out anyway, because there is a comfort to obviously walking up to a door that opens automatically, and it's probably not practical thereafter to remove it. So it's, again, it depends on the level of intervention that occurs at the outset or over time. That's obviously all measured against the levels of intervention or the level of control that we will have to continue to make. At this point in time, we don't know. Obviously, the guidance is suggesting that by the end of the summer, all workplaces will return. We don't know. In terms of physical distancing, as I said earlier, I think that will continue in some fashion. It may not be the 2 meter separation, but I think it may be something like 1 meter, which is obviously a significant reduction on what's there at the moment. But I can't tell. We don't know. Nobody knows. But
it's a case of following the HSE guidelines, I suppose, isn't it? And
yeah, and a lot of the controls that need to be put in place are, I suppose, I'd best describe them as passive. Signage, the kind of practices and the way we use buildings is as important, perhaps, as the physical changes that we'll have to put in. So a lot of the things we'll do will just be a change in how we engage and interact with the building and with colleagues, rather than making huge structural changes within buildings. Obviously, again, depending on the different types of buildings, there may need to be some, in some cases, partitions may need to be taken down. Fire doors, for example, may need to be put on hold open devices linked back to the fire alarm system. So there are costs associated with doing things like that. But I think in the main, the intervention that we would, from what we've seen, certainly in the last couple of weeks in the properties we've looked at, a lot of the intervention that we're recommending, which seems to be consistent with implementing the measures that are recommended, are fairly passive. We're not talking about major structural changes that would certainly have a considerable cost now and a cost at the end, let's say, to return them.
And I think that will give employers a bit of solace in that they're not going to have to spend potentially hundreds of thousands in structurally redesigning their office space and then looking at that cost again in the future. That what you're saying is it's passive changes, it's changes that can be quite flexible and ongoing, I suppose, if you move it.
In many cases, yes. But again, it said obviously no two buildings are the same. Yeah. But generally, from our recent experience of assessing different building types, we're not looking at a huge expense typically.
Look, thanks for answering my questions, Jerry. You've given us a lot of food for thought, I should say. I'll open it up to anyone who's got any questions. I think we've one question at the moment, but if you have any questions for Jerry, just fire them through and we'll see if we can get through a couple of them. So somebody's just mentioned here, and I know we've talked about it already, Jerry, is around the kind of the WeWork spaces and shared office space. They're probably under a completely different challenge.
Yes, I think the community environment, whether it's co-working or co-living, I think they will have particular challenges going forward, simply down to the nature of the kind of the type of buildings that they are and how they use them in terms of density and occupancy. So that model, I suppose, will have to carefully evaluate where it's at and how it moves into the future, given the restrictions that are currently in place, certainly. So there are certainly challenges there, just as much as there are challenges with the both food and beverage and manufacturing. Any area really where there's close proximity to people in the ordinary kind of day-to-day activities, they have to reevaluate how they do what they do and how they can do it in the future, certainly.
Okay, thanks for that. Are there any other questions from anyone at the moment? Doesn't seem to be too many, Jerry. But any final thought from yourself before you go? Is there anything?
No, look, I suppose obviously everybody's concerned with where we're at, and in particular, I suppose in the context of our conversation here about the workplace, and you refer to it about the changes that are needed to be made and the impact of them going forward. I suppose industry adapts. We look at, for example, the introduction of the changes to the Part M legislation in respect of access and use of buildings. That resulted in far greater sizes for lobbies in buildings, wider corridors, and so on. At the time, there was a concern about, particularly with the impact on net to gross floor areas and lettable floor areas, and so on. But the industry has adapted, and those regulations have come into effect, and there hasn't been any issues. Similarly, if we look at, I suppose, procedurally, you look at the BCARs, the Building Control Amendment Regulations, quite a brouhaha about those when they were introduced a couple of years ago. But again, the industry has adapted to implement those, and said we adapt and we evolve, and we keep going, and that's what we have to do.
Yeah. And when we look back, won't seem so different. It'll just be as people are calling it.
The new normal. Exactly.
Well, Jerry, you've been a gentleman. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to join us. Following up with a recording of this for anybody that wasn't able to attend. Likewise, if you are looking to make any changes to your office, feel free to reach out to Jerry directly and his team. They'll be able to provide advice and tell you more about what you might need to know. They've also published a document outlining the kind of 3 phases, as Jerry alluded to, so we'll look to share that with all the attendees and everyone who's registered as well after this. So again, thank you, Jerry. Look out yourself. I'm sure you're going to be very busy in the weeks ahead, so all the best with that, and we'll speak to you soon.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you to all our viewers today. Thank you very much. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Take care.